Mazzini da Comissão Europeia, fellow do MIT e dos autores responsáveis pelo AI Act europeu. Gabriele, I'll be here in the States, but I'll be right here to avoid being like right in the front of your slides. But the floor is yours, and again, thank you a lot for joining us in this conversation. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, ATS Rio and Abranet for the invitation. It's a huge pleasure to be here. It's also my first time in Brazil, so I'm very excited to be here. And so what I would like to do, we have about 20 minutes. I would like to give you a bit of a sense of the work that was done in the EU regarding the AI Act. I suppose most of you know the AI Act is the first sort of comprehensive legislation on AI that is about to be finalized. In fact, all the votes has been concluded. We are waiting for the essentially publication in the official journal, which would happen between June and July, for entering to force, therefore, around August. So first of all, and this is a slide actually I use a lot also in Europe, because as you know, the EU is an international organization made up of several member states of Europe. And it's important to understand a bit the institutional architecture, because sometimes, I've heard in the last couple of months, actually the last year, a lot of versions of the AI Act moving around, and people were a bit confused who does what. So just to be clear, the European Commission is the executive, is essentially where I've been working. And the European Commission has a peculiarity in the EU institutional framework. It has exclusive power to propose legislation. Unlike in national countries, like in Italy, for instance, where I'm from, or in Germany, or other countries, generally Parliament can also submit proposals for legislation. In the EU, only the Commission can do that. So as you can imagine, the Commission has quite an important role in setting the agenda of the EU. And then the proposal, which was issued in April 2021, is sent at the same time to two other institutions, is the European Parliament and the Council. Those institutions have the same power. It's a bit like a bicameral system where you have House of Representatives and Senate. So they have the same power, which means that they have to agree to adopt legislation. And the Parliament is directly elected by the people in each member state. So actually, this weekend, there are new elections, European elections in the EU. So each member state votes, in each member state, people vote for their representatives, and the Parliament therefore represents the people. The Council is the institution that represents the governments. So it's composed of all the governments of the member states. And the final agreement is usually done in what are called trilogues. So essentially these are meetings between delegations of the three institutions, discussing essentially a final deal. Based on what? On what is the Commission proposal, which is the starting text. Then the Council also makes its own opinion, which happened in this case in December 2022, and the Parliament as well. So each institution, or each of the two co-legislators, analyzes the text by the Commission and decides what its own ideal version should be. So then they enter into this bilateral or trilateral negotiations, having their starting position. The Commission is not a decision maker in the final stages of the discussion. Our role is to technically advise, but the decision makers is Parliament and Council. So you will see that some decisions were made are quite different from what the Commission had proposed. So I want to spend a few minutes discussing some background. So how we got where we are today. Essentially, the work on AI by the European Commission started quite early, or in general by the European institutions, I should say, because the first institution that issued a document around, let's say, AI or robotics, initially in 2017, actually, AI was not yet a buzzword. There was a lot of discussion around big data, IoT, robotics. It was from the Parliament, a recommendation on civil law rules on robotics. Then, in 2018, the European Commission came up with its first policy document, which is the document here on the left-hand side, Artificial Intelligence for Europe. The main goal of this document was to essentially launch a high-level expert group, so a group of experts, independent from the Commission, composed of around 52 people from all representatives, so there were people from academia, from civil society, from government, from trade unions, industry, of course. And they were mandated to elaborate two essential deliverables. The first one was draft ethic guidelines on trustworthy AI, and the second one was policy and investment recommendations. So this work is the work of an independent expert group. But the goal was to help the Commission thinking through the process about what should be done or could be done on AI. At the same time, the Commission launched a platform, a European AI Alliance, which was an online forum for discussions open to everybody on issues around AI. And this platform was used a lot during the discussion of the deliverables by the high-level expert group, but also continued to be used also afterwards, when the work of the high-level expert group concluded. Fast forward, 2019-2020, we have a new commission. The current commission, von der Leyen Commission, took office in 2019. And why I mention this? Because von der Leyen had in her programmatic guidelines a commitment to deliver a European legislation on AI. So her entry into office gave a political mandate for the Commission to start working on a legal framework on AI on the basis of the work that was already going on. The first thing that we did as Commission was developing a white paper. So the white paper was essentially a rather a first reflection on some policy options around how to deal with what we call ecosystem of excellence and ecosystem of trust around AI. Ecosystem of excellence is around the development of AI, the development of the skills around AI. So what are the tools that we need in order for being developers? And ecosystem of trust is more around the rules that we need to put in place to ensure that AI systems are trustworthy. So it's more the regulatory part, the regulation. So the white paper triggered a huge amount of interest. So we had around more than 1,000 respondents, including extensive documents, PDFs of 20, 30 pages, academic articles, from all sectors, so citizens, businesses, civil society, academia, public authorities, and also from outside Europe, actually. Around, here is marked, I don't see the percentage, but almost 1/4 of the contributions were from entities or persons outside Europe. At the same time, the Parliament also issued a number of resolutions during these years around AI. I also want to mention that before the Commission issued the proposal, we also had to undergo a process called impact assessment. This is part of our so-called better regulation guidelines, meaning that this is not special to AI. This is actually typical for all regulatory proposals by the Commission. The Commission needs to develop an impact assessment which consists of several steps. Primarily, it's about problem definition. So what is the problem we want to solve? What are the drivers of that problem? What are the objectives we want to achieve? And the impact. So we need to evaluate the cost of compliance, the impact on SME, which are many in Europe, effect on innovation and competitiveness. So all these considerations were at the basis of the impact assessment, which was supported also by a study by a contractor to do literature review, evaluation of the public consultations which were done, including this input from this online platform, and the cost estimates. And so at the bottom you see sort of a matrix about all the options that were evaluated, the pluses, the minuses, and this helped somehow determine what the actual legal proposal could look like. Finally, a couple of words about the work of the co-legislators, because as I said, the Commission makes the proposal, it's sent to European Parliament and to the Council. They do their own process of analyzing and coming up with solutions and opinions. And this process looks a bit like this. When it comes to the Council, you may be familiar with this concept of 6 months rotating presidency. So meaning every 6 months in the Council there is a new presidency of different member states. So you see that the Council worked on the AI Act for 6 presidencies. Some of them were more influential than the others, simply because of the matter in which, the stages in which the file was. I can mention here, for instance, the French presidency, which really engaged in substance with the legal text and the amendments by the member states. The Czech presidency was the presidency who actually concluded the political negotiations in the Council by defining what is the position by the Council, the negotiation position by the Council, so-called general approach. And then the Spanish presidency was the presidency who actually engaged in the trilogues negotiations with the Parliament. On the side of the Parliament, also to signify the importance of the file, this typically you have one committee that is responsible for a file. In this case, we had 2 committees, Internal Market Committee and Civil Liberties Committees, with 2 rapporteurs from 2 different political groups. And on top of that, other 5 committees in the Parliament had some sort of partial competence. So essentially the text was divided in several sections, and some committees had, for instance, the Legal Affairs Committee or the Cult committees, had some degree of competence over certain articles. I have to admit that this may not have been always the most efficient. Of course, this sometimes led to some fragmentation, but it's to say that everyone had somewhat a stake and interest in this process and wanted to express a view. And on the side of the Parliament as well, they held a lot of workshops, hearings, they issued studies, and generally ongoing exchanges with stakeholders. The same happened on the side of the Council, where typically the governments, they engage with national stakeholders in the capital, and then their input supports the opinion of each member states in Brussels. So that's enough about the process. In terms of content, I want to show you 3 slides. I have to go through a little bit faster because I think I'm running out of time. It's fine? Okay, good. So this is the most important slide. So if I have 5 minutes for a presentation, this is the slide I show. Because let's read the fundamental idea to regulate not just the technology per se, but the use cases. And how do we do that? Our idea was to establish rules that are tailored to the type of risk. So essentially, the higher the risk, the more stringent the rules. In practice, this means that we created 3 layers of risk, or 3 plus 1, where the 4th layer, the green layer, is essentially a layer of applications that are not subject to the AI Act, except on a voluntary basis. So, in fact, when we think about binding rules, we are thinking about the first 3 layers. So the first layer is about cases where certain uses of AI are considered, from our point of view, in the light of our charter, on our treaties, unacceptable. Because essentially the idea would be that we consider there is no countervailing counter value in ensuring that certain uses are allowed. So they are prohibited. In some cases, in one case, there is an exception, for instance, in the use of remote biometric identification, where it's, as a matter of principle, prohibited, but allowed in certain circumstances. Also, during the negotiations, these use cases were always changed. So the Commission started with 4 prohibitions, and the final text has 8 prohibitions. So it's quite more. The second layer is about high risk. High risk means that an application poses certain risks to health, safety, or fundamental rights. But at the same time, there is a value in keeping these applications on the market, in making them possible to be used on the market. Because they also can deliver better outcomes, although they may lead to some risk if not properly managed, but they also lead to better outcomes. Therefore, when an application is considered high risk, and we'll see in a second how that happens, the application will be allowed, but subject to compliance with certain requirements, AI requirements, and a procedure for conformity assessment. This procedure has to attest that the product, the AI system, has been developed in accordance with the requirements. Here we used our concept of CE mark. You may be familiar with this concept. So the CE mark that is used in virtually all products in the EU, starting from instance from medical devices to toys to machinery, signals that a certain product has been developed and manufactured in compliance with EU law, and therefore can freely circulate within the EU. And of course, also foreign manufacturers or foreign providers will have to comply with these rules, not just on AI, but in general. So let's say a manufacturer of a medical device that wants to import that medical device or software, actually in the EU, an AI-based software is a medical device when it has a medical purpose. They already have to comply with legislation on medical devices. The third category is around cases where the risk is essentially related to the lack of transparency. Lack of transparency that is related either to the system itself, for instance, a chatbot, where there may be a risk of impersonation. So we want to make sure that people are aware that they're interacting with a machine and not with another human. This is particularly relevant in the case of generative AI. And again, when we think about generative AI, we think about synthetic content. So in this risk classification, we find cases where indeed content is being synthetically generated, where it's about video, sound, and we want to ensure transparency. So the Commission has proposed a labeling obligation. During the negotiation of the AI Act, we ended up with, in some cases, even more. Essentially, an obligation for the provider of the generative AI system to actually ensure that this certain content can be detected, technically speaking, as synthetic. So I mentioned before high risk. And how do we determine what is high risk? Considering the horizontal nature of the AI Act, we decided to adopt 2 different approaches. According to the first approach, related to the systems mentioned in the Annex 1, AI systems are considered high risk when they are a safety component of a product that is already subject to EU law. I mentioned before medical devices. I mentioned toys, radio equipment, machinery. So all these are products that are already regulated and that are increasingly having digital components. When the digital component is AI, and it plays a role in terms of the safety function of the product, then the AI is high risk and therefore is subject to the compliance requirements of the AI Act, if the product to which the AI is a component is subject to third-party conformity assessment. It's a bit complicated, but the idea was to say we want to anchor the riskiness of the AI system that is a component of a product to the level of risk of the product as determined by sectorial legislation. So we wanted to anchor this, make this link. Because indeed, products are considered, let's say, medical devices. Not all are subject to the same conformity assessment. Some medical devices are subject to third-party conformity assessment, some other medical device not. And typically, this is a signal of the riskiness of the product. So we wanted to align as much as possible to that logic. The second category is about essentially products or systems that are not regulated today, not directly, at least as a product. So what we did was to identify 8 areas, major areas, as you see them in the screen, like education, employment, migration, law enforcement. They are rather broad. But this does not mean that the whole area is high risk. It's only systems that are explicitly listed in the annex. So we have an annex that identifies these areas, and under each area, there is a specific exclusive list of systems. For instance, in employment, there are systems used for hiring, systems used for firing, or system used for management of employees. So not all AI that can be used in employment is high risk. And the reason why we did that is because we wanted to, on the one hand, enable the decision around the areas by the legislator. So Council and Parliament had to decide, okay, we want this area as a potential area where we can have high-risk AI systems, but allowing the Commission, which is the executive, to update the use cases, depending on market evolution, depending on, indeed, accidents, for instance. So this distinction is important because sometimes people confused and tell me, oh, but the whole education sector is high risk. No, that is actually not the case. One needs to see the specific systems that are listed. If you're not in that list, you may be considered perhaps prohibited in certain cases, or you may be considered subject to transparency obligations, but you're not high risk. And finally, that's the last slide. It's perhaps the most complex, I should say, because this was exactly one part of the final AI Act that was not part of the Commission proposal. There is a number of reasons why we ended up with this framework. This, let's say, someone says it's a regulation in the regulation, because the regulation of general purpose AI models somehow breaks with the approach of the Commission proposal to regulate the system, so essentially to regulate application level. Here, the regulation of general purpose AI models goes, if you want, upstream in the value chain and establishes rules for models. We call them general purpose AI models, but the thinking behind is that of foundation models. It's a terminology that is actually much more known in the community because it was popularized with a paper from some researcher in Stanford in, I think, 2020. So the risk and opportunities of foundation models. These are the models like the one behind ChatGPT, like GPT-3 or GPT-4, that are typically models based on, trained on large amount of data, ultra-aggressive, kind of predict the next token. But they can certainly have attracted a lot of attention. And so this is what happened during our process. The emergence of ChatGPT during the legislative process made sure that also political authorities paid attention to this new phenomenon. We had also some debates, you may be aware, around the risk of some of these models, around, for instance, catastrophic risk. Some talked also about existential risk. And therefore, the debate was somewhat focused on trying to find a solution on this type of technology in reality. And this is a bit what makes this section of the regulation a bit different from the others, because it kind of focuses on a specific technology, whereas the other sections focus on AI system and not on whether you use, let's say, supervised learning, unsupervised learning, what kind of architecture. We ended up with a system of two-tier, where essentially these models are subject, all of these models that are classified as foundation models or general purpose are subject to certain rules. The first type of rules are around primarily transparency. The second tier is when these models can, let's say, lead with some sort of systemic risk. And here there is a complexity, which is about how do we determine when a foundation model leads to systemic risk. The choice of the co-legislator has been to link that determination to the flops, so it's a compute parameter used to train that model. You may, for those of you who are followed a bit the work of in the US, notably the executive order by President Biden in October, there is a reference to flops also in that document, with the difference that they refer to 10 to 26, so it's a higher threshold. And of course, you know, an executive order by the president is not a legislation by the Congress, like it would be the AI Act. So that's one way in which these models can be classified as belonging to the higher tier. There is another way which is linked to a designation by the AI office, which is the Commission. This borrows, if you want, the logic of the Digital Services Act, for those of you who are familiar, where the Commission can designate platforms as very large online platforms. And this triggers some additional obligations. So here you go, we have a bit the similar approach when it comes to general purpose AI models. Certain models can be subject to additional rules around risk management, incident reporting, or cybersecurity when designated by the Commission. I think I really went over, but I'll stop it here. I'm happy to take questions during the debate. Thank you.